A lot of the creatures we think of as monsters or monstrous are really just doing their jobs. The one at Delphi, for example, that Apollo kills, that's just guarding the sacred site.
Welcome to Lesky, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. One of the weirdest and funnest works to survive from classical Greece is attributed to someone supposedly named Palaephatus. The title is Περὶ ἀπίστων, or Unbelievable Stories. The work rationalizes mythological tales by providing logical explanations for seemingly impossible events. So, for example, Palaephatus explains that the centaurs were not actual half-horse, half-human creatures, but instead a group of skilled horsemen whose riding abilities led to exaggerated stories about them. The chimera wasn't a literal fire-breathing monster, but rather was the name of a mountain with a fire-breathing peak that was guarded by a lion and a snake. We know nothing about Palaephatus himself. His text wasn't transmitted with any clear date, but from his writing style, we tend to assume that he lived in the 4th century BCE. And that would make sense given a passage from Plato's Phaedrus, which opens in a way that sharply recalls Palaephatus. At the beginning of the dialogue, Phaedrus and Socrates are walking outside Athens. Phaedrus asks about the spot where Boreas, the god of the north wind, supposedly carried off Orithyia, the daughter of the mythical king Erechtheus, while she was gathering flowers. When Phaedrus asks if Socrates believes this tale, this is what Socrates says. If I, like the wise, disbelieved this tale, I would be unremarkable. In that case, I would wisely declare that Boreas, the north wind, swept her from the nearby rocks as she played with Pharmakeia, and thus dying, she was said to have been carried away by Boreas. So he provides a rationalizing explanation, much like the ones that we find in Palaephatus. He then continues. He says, I find such explanations generally charming, but they belong to the domain of a very clever, diligent, yet not entirely fortunate individual. For this line of reasoning also requires us to correct our understanding of centaurs, then chimeras, and a whole host of other similar creatures, gorgons, pegasi, and an unimaginable multitude of other extraordinary legendary beasts. Someone who disbelieves these stories and tries to rationalize them through common sense wisdom will be exceedingly busy, but I have no time for such endeavors. What's his reason? Well, he says, I am not yet able, as the Delphic inscription advises, to know myself. Indeed, it seems absurd to me to investigate extraneous matters while I remain ignorant of this, and therefore I bid these issues farewell. I accept the traditional views about them, as I've just explained, and instead of investigating them, I investigate myself. So then Socrates explicitly disavows the kind of rational mythologizing performed by Palaephatus. He's more interested in knowing himself than in knowing what, quote-unquote, really happened in myths. But what if Socrates was wrong to dismiss the study of monsters so quickly? What if investigating creatures like centaurs and chimeras and gorgons isn't actually wholly separate from the project of knowing the self? The thing about monsters, of course, is that they don't emerge from nowhere. They're created by human minds, shaped by human anxieties, and they reflect human preoccupations back to us in exaggerated, distorted forms. The monsters of mythology aren't just fantastical diversions, they're mirrors in a way. Think of Medusa's gaze, or the Sphinx's riddle, or Gerion's stationing at the ends of the known world. My guests for this episode, Debbie Felton and Carolina López-Ruiz, have both contributed to exploring exactly this issue. Debbie has recently edited the new Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth, a volume that prominently features this theme of monsters as reflections of human selves. And Carolina contributed a chapter to it on the Sphinx. One of the points you'll hear us touch on in our discussion is that, in many ways, the study of monsters and the study of the self aren't opposing projects after all. In fact, investigation of monsters might be one of the most revealing ways that we have of getting at the inner lives of ancient people. Their desires, their fears, their sense of what it meant to be human in a world where the boundaries of humanity were constantly being tested and redefined. Debbie Felton, professor of classics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, specializes in ancient folklore. Her books include Haunted Greece and Rome, Ghost Stories from Classical Antiquity, Monsters and Monarchs, Serial Killers in Classical Myth and History, and the edited volumes A Cultural History of Fairy Tales in Antiquity and the Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth. She has appeared in various media in the US and Europe, including Coast to Coast AM, Weird Tales, and CBS Mornings, and she also runs the Ancient Monsters blog. Carolina López-Ruiz is professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School, Classics Department, and also the department's chair, and memory of ISAC, or the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. She specializes in ancient Mediterranean mythology, religion, Greek and Near Eastern cultural exchange, and Phoenician culture. Her latest books are Phoenicians and the Making of the Mediterranean from 2021 and Greek Mythology, From Creation to First Humans, just out this year. She co-directs an excavation at the Phoenician site of Cerro del Villar in Malaga, Spain. Just a quick note that, as ever, I've put a few references in the show notes for this episode. And yet another reminder that Lesky is on Instagram. The handle is @LeskyPodcast. Now I'd like to welcome into the Lesky Debbie Felton and Carolina López-Ruiz. The next voice you'll be hearing is Debbie's.
So the Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth was a huge project, but a really fun one to work on. The way it got started was kind of boring, I'm afraid, which is that I actually received an email from the commissioning editor at OUP, Oxford University Press, at the time. And, she basically said that they were considering a handbook on monsters and classical mythology for their handbook series. And she was apparently writing, she said, I'd be grateful to receive any advice you can offer. And she basically described what they were looking for, maybe 30 essays. We ended up with 40, of course, 10,000 words or so each. And what she said, we're looking for advice on the sorts of topics such a handbook might usefully cover and how it might be mapped out. And she also said that they were wondering if I had any pointers on who could edit such a volume. And then she said that, if I were interested, they could take a proposal from me. So basically it was OUP that had initiated the project, and I thought, yeah, I could do that.
Did she say anything about why?
Why me?
Or no, not why you, but why they were interested in this kind of project?
She didn't actually. But at that time, back in 2019, I was also contacted by another press about a similar anthology. Like monsters had been becoming more popular. Classics is always like 10 years late to the party, right? So, 10 years after everybody else was using Lacanian theory, classics started reading Lacan. Well, 10 or so years after medieval studies and English departments started doing monster studies, classics was finally getting in on it. And so around 2019 was when they were starting to look around and realize maybe, monsters and classical myth, maybe we could update, some of our information about that and why it's all still popular. So I think that was probably the reason, was just that monsters were becoming, were sort of, they'd always been there, right? There's always been reception of classical monsters and classical tradition and all that. But, for some reason at that point in time, there was just a resurgence of interest in let's bring it back and look at it from fresh perspectives, I guess might be a way to put it.
And what first sparked your interest in monsters? What kind of work had you done on them in the past? I'd
always been interested in classical mythology and folklore, and my earlier work had been on ghosts and witches. And I had been contacted at one point, I guess it was back around 2010, to write a chapter on monsters in classical myth for the Ashgate companion to Monsters and the Monstrous. And this was being done by one of those people by a couple of people, one in medieval art history and another in medieval studies, where monster theory was kind of at its peak. And again, I thought, well, I've been teaching classical myth for ages, and yeah, I'd love the chance to write about monsters. So it started with me by writing that chapter, which I think came out in about 2012 or something. And then, I'd had the ghosts and witches, and so monster-related topics without actually delving into the monsters themselves before that point.
So when you were then signed on to for this project, and you mentioned that there are 40 chapters, which is a lot. Yeah. How did you think about structuring the volume? Maybe you could say a little bit about the 4 parts that you divided it into and what the rationale was for that.
Yeah, well, that developed slowly over time because I started, aiming for the 30 that they had asked about. And I think the original proposal that I sent them had probably 25 or 30 chapters. And they sent the general proposal out for review, and it came back with very positive reviews, but also, what about disability studies? What about colonialism? And, just topics that I hadn't thought about so much. And that's where, a lot of the reception chapters ended up coming from. And they were fine with having 40 chapters and, the broader coverage. And some of the chapters were shorter, some were closer to 6,000 or 7,000 instead of 10,000. So, we hit our word limit just fine without, And, but the organization then, because of the suggestions in the 4 readers' reports, that helped shape the 4 sections. So the first and most obvious section was on the monsters themselves, like the Sphinx, for example, or the Minotaur, the Chimera. And then because we wanted to expand the concept of, it wasn't just monsters, it was the monstrous, a section on, animals like real animals that were interpreted as monsters, some ghosts, for example, and ghosts, monster adjacent, classical monster adjacent types of monstrous creatures seemed worth including. And that's how we ended up with the monstrous peoples, for example, that John Friedman wrote about, like the Kunokephali, the dog-headed people, also the chapter on ghosts, and then the sort of bogies like the Lamii and Ampusai, which, are basically monstrous entities, but monstrous spirit entities rather than monstrous animal hybrid creatures. So that seemed to make sense. And then there was a lot of interpretation of the monsters, so we wanted to come at it from, again, disability studies, colonialism, psychoanalytical approaches, feminist approaches, rationalizing theory, which is one of the newer ones. So a whole section on interpreting the monsters made sense, especially given what the reviewers, thought the book could use more of. And then the last section, the 4th section, is the reception of classical monsters. And so that had to do with, where do we see the influence and adaptation of them? And so Plinian monsters in Norse literature, for example, what else the Italian Renaissance, medieval art, post-colonial shows its face there too. Classical monsters in Latin American cultures was a nice thing to have. There were obviously topics that we didn't get. For example, I had tried contacting some colleagues in Asian studies to get, the intersection of, say, Chinese and classical monsters, like do they have similar monsters, etc. And so some of what we wanted to get just didn't work out in terms of people's time or the intersections that we were looking for. Just there really wasn't anybody who specialized in them, etc. But we did the best that we could in terms of getting people, and also we hit the pandemic. So we did have some people have to drop out during the project, but we ended up with our nice round number of 40 chapters. Yeah,
it is a nice number. I mean, one of the things I think that's really striking about the volume is the breadth of the scope, both chronologically, so where you start really at the very beginnings, and then you have that 4th sort of more reception-oriented part, but then also geographically, you cast this really wide net into Egypt, the ancient Levant, Mesopotamian material. And so I was wondering, Carolina, because this is the material or the fields that you're coming from, in addition to your expertise in classics, could you maybe say a little bit about what has been going on in terms of scholarship, your own scholarship, other people's scholarship on monsters and the monstrous from this more comparative ancient Near Eastern perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. I think that definitely there's been more interest, to the degree that we're doing more scholarship that integrates Near Eastern and Greek and other materials. I think monsters are a very fruitful locus to explore these connections, because you have they have a pretty prominent role in iconography, right? Like you have these guardian monsters, or they appear in magical objects. So there's been some nice scholarship. For instance, Maddie Ritchie, who has a chapter in the volume too, and Jesse De Grado have been working on this Mesopotamian, Pazuzu, and other things like that, as they appear in magical artifacts, but as they have this mythological background as well. So there is all these crossings between types of materials and literature, and sometimes you see convergences, sometimes you see divergences between the iconography and the myth. So I can talk about that. In regards to the Sphinx, it's an interesting case to see that. So I think there is just very fruitful, because then you see adaptations of these Near Eastern monsters, be it the guardians or the Humbaba types of things, and what are the similar types of entities in Greek culture. And in some cases, the lines are pretty clear that there is an adaptation of Near Eastern motifs. So it's just, I think that the interest in monsters has accompanied the expansion of work on broader Mediterranean, and especially Near Eastern and Greek mythology and iconography and religion and magic, all that.
Would you say that this is a place where there is really like a lot of contact that is traceable?
I think so. I mean, from my research on Greek and Near Eastern mythology, I think that there's something about monsters, perhaps because there's this visual aspect that lends itself a lot to adaptations, say, like jumps, let's say, from visual aspect of a monster and a story, right? Or interpretations of what is an image of, a frontal face of Humbaba, let's say, and then you adapt it and merge it with a myth of the Gorgons, and you use the Near Eastern type of iconography to express maybe a myth that existed already in Greece. But it's just this combination, I think, of iconography that was traveling around or that was seen by different peoples, and transfers of stories and knowledge and interpretations. I think that's very fruitful, because monsters are so so, I don't know, so striking, right? So interesting, that memorable, right? Mm-hmm. That people would want to understand what they are or apply what they see to something they know in their own culture. So I do think that there's something special about these hybrid creatures or scary creatures or guardian creatures that lends itself particularly to cultural adaptation.
Well, it seems too that if monsters are by definition different and othered and sort of exotic, that also in particular would really lend itself to appropriation or borrowing of another culture's iconographic grammar or whatever to only emphasize that otherness.
Exactly. Yeah, they appear a lot in Orientalizing culture, what we call Orientalizing culture, right? They feature a lot there.
I completely agree with Carolina, because one of the things that became clear from, looking over all the chapters was there really was a definite movement from east to west. So there doesn't seem to be any question that the Near Eastern art, iconography, and, we know that the literature definitely moved that way. And now, and it's become pretty clear that the art and iconographical aspects of Near Eastern art also made their way over. And so the connections go way back. I was, one of the things that I had tossed around with Oxford Press initially was, do we want a more, a broader title? Because the title is, the Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth. And, we knew we were going to be covering a much broader, area than that. But something like, monsters, monsters in the ancient Mediterranean world was just a little too long for what they wanted. I think they're looking for something more concise. So ultimately we ended up with Monsters of Classical Myth, despite the fact that going in, from the very beginning, we knew it was going to be much broader than that. And especially in terms of showing some of the origins of the classical monsters.
Well, one thing that I want to come back to, Carolina, is something that you were getting at and that you really get at beautifully, I think, in your chapter on the Sphinx, is how the iconographic evidence and the literary evidence sometimes are not telling the same story, that there's a kind of a disjunct between them. So I definitely want to come back to that. But first, Debbie, you had mentioned medieval studies and the development of monster theory within medieval studies. And I think that listeners might be interested just, for people who haven't encountered monster theory before. Could you maybe just say a few words about what that is?
Sure. It's generally associated with Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who wrote a book on like the book that sort of started the monster theory rolling. And I got the impression when I met him that he was maybe getting a little tired of having that be the main thing associated.
Maybe he keeps getting typecast now. Yeah.
Well, given all the other work that he does, but it was it just put a lot of discussion about monsters and their meanings in one place. So in terms of how have people analyzed monsters prior to that publication, which is something like 20, 25 years old at least at this point. So there were a lot of aspects to monsters that he mentioned that people hadn't really necessarily, elucidated or explicated as specifically before. So the monster is the other, sure, but what does that mean? Are monsters inherently evil? No, not necessarily. They dwell on the borders of possibilities, like physical, literal borders, of geographically, also the borders of, ontologically what they are in terms of being composite creatures, hybrids, their behavior, outside the norms of society. They're associated with nature rather than culture a lot of the time. So a lot of this, what Jeffrey Jerome Cohen did in his book about monster theories, and specifically his own essay on, monster culture, 7 Theses, was list a lot of these aspects of what monsters meant and how monsters are culturally defined. You had said earlier, depending on the culture, the monster becomes the other, and that's why they're adapted and changed. And so the monsters tend to be used to represent fears and anxieties of various cultures during specific points in time even. I could point to something like aliens from outer space, became sort of a popular trope as the space program was getting underway. We suddenly started seeing more movies about aliens invading Earth.
This made me think of how, if we think about the world of archaic Greece, or where a lot of these Near Eastern monsters kind of come into the Greek mythological world, it's a time of exploration, right, of unknown areas, colonization of the Western Mediterranean, going to the far ends of the world, the Pillars of Heracles, all that. And a lot of these monsters kind of travel as the Greeks travel as well. And you put, Geryon, right, at the very edge of the Western world, at the limits. Then you have the whole Odyssean world of Cyclops and other monsters. So there is some of the basic thinking about this, but that resonates with what you are talking about in terms of the modern world, is this fear, obviously fear of the unknown, but of whether representing unknown peoples, unknown societies, unknown social norms, or really unknown territories and dangers and so on. So I think that runs very kind of in a very basic line in Greek mythology. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I also wonder, though, is that thinking about the popularity of, tellings like Wicked, or, modern tellings of stories, fairy tales from the monsters. When I grew up, there was the retelling of the 3 little pigs from the Big Bad Wolf's perspective, or what, this kind of thing. But and I wonder how many people know about like Theocritus 11, where we have now the Cyclops in love, and he's like a very, sweet, shepherd, cottage cheese, whatever making kind of guy who's just in love with Callatiae. Is there much of that, Debbie or Carolina? I'm curious how much of there is of this, then people kind of trying to imagine the situation from the quote unquote monster's perspective.
I was thinking that to some degree, the Polyphemus, or the Cyclops in the Odyssey, there is some point where you feel a little bit of like Odysseus went too far, and the poor guy, right? There's something like that, but in general, I'm having a hard time thinking about that.
There's not too much of this, he's just misunderstood kind of.
Exactly. So, but that's interesting too, like how rather the movies tends to be that by rationalizing, well, the Sphinx was really a daughter of Laios who was also trying to get the throne, so she ended up killing people for it, or she was a pirate. Like there are all kinds of historicizing, rationalizing moves, and a lot of those trends like Palaephatus and others, they fixate on monsters, which is something I didn't realize until recently teaching a mythology class on ancient criticisms of myth. And they fixate on monsters like the centaurs or hybrid centaurs, Cyclops, Sphinxes, or because it's very interesting. Like they're like, well, that's not physiologically possible.
Yeah,
So there's
exactly.
Aristotelian move like that doesn't exist, and if it cannot exist now, it did not exist in the past. So it's obviously a demythologizing attempt of trying to actually explain it, and monsters are at the center of that because they defy the laws of nature, obviously.
Yeah, and something I would add to that, besides the attempts at rationalizing the creatures in terms of physiological impossibilities, even if we read the Cyclops episode in the Odyssey and feel like, oh, he went a little too far, and we do feel sorry for him when he's blinded and can't feel, I just don't think the ancient Greeks would have felt that way about it, you know. So that's the odd thing is, I mean, if they had, you know, the Greeks reading Theocritus, would they have felt that characterization of Polyphemus was gentle or just completely, you know, whacked? I mean, just completely weird. And I mean, when you all mentioned this, I was actually thinking again of a heroine, which is not so much a monster, but a monstrous, monsterized female, I guess, which is Medea's speech in Euripides' Medea, where she's saying, you know, but I helped you. You would never have gone through past the, you know, bronze-footed, fire-breathing bulls without me. And you know, and there's just no sympathy for her from Jason. And I wonder, you know, what the Greek audience hearing her speech would have thought. Would they have had any sympathy for her? Or would they have been like, yeah, no, Jason, rationality, you know? So it's a little hard to know the extent to which they would have had any sympathy for these kinds of characterizations, even when the authors are maybe trying to, you know, for their part, elicit a little sympathy. It's really hard to know.
I'm thinking Humbaba is a good case where, you know, actually going way back from the Greek world to Mesopotamia, because I think that is really in the story that he is both a scary monster, but he's a divine guardian of the forest, the cedar forest, and that Gilgamesh and Enkidu, when they kill him, they are really doing a wrongdoing. Like they might look like they're going on a great heroic quest, but they pay the consequences, much like in Polyphemus' case or in the Cyclops case. But there is some sense of Humbaba is begging for his life, and there's nothing he's done wrong, really, and they should not be killing him. So there's some empathy there, I think.
Oh, that's interesting, and it sort of reminds me too that a lot of the creatures we think of as monsters or monstrous are really just doing their jobs, like they're guardians. So many of the monsters are just guardians.
Exactly.
I mean, okay, a lot of the creatures that Heracles fights, they're like ravaging the land and killing livestock. Okay, that's a problem, right? So you want to get rid of the Nemean lion and their Linnaean hydra, you know, whatever. But so many of the other, you know, giant snake. I mean, the dragon guarding the fleece, the golden fleece, interestingly, is not killed. It's just put to sleep. I don't know what happens to it after the thing it's guarding is gone. Like, are there going to be consequences? There are a lot of guardian monsters that are just doing their jobs. The one at Delphi, for example, that Apollo kills. Right. I mean, that's just guarding the sacred site. The one guarding the spring that Cadmus kills. You know, Cadmus kills the guardian serpent there. So, so in that sense, I don't know if we're running up against the, civilizing force and colonizing force of men coming up against, nature and the chthonic, the earth-related creatures. But from our modern perspective, these monsters are just doing their jobs.
Well, and they're partly, I mean, those jobs are set up by the gods, it's presumed, or the monsters are connected to some of them very more explicitly than others, like Pytho or the Cyclops or others. They are connected to the gods directly, right? And they are performing some duties. So there is a sense in which, they belong partly to the divine world. So there is something you should be respecting about them, maybe. But also they represent. Usually we say they represent chaos, but they represent chaos because they challenge that world order setup that is in cosmogonic myth, right? That things are in a certain way in nature, sort of, and that's set up by the gods since the beginning. Like there's light and day and night and the sea and the earth and whatever and elements, and things have a certain logic, and they defy that. So there is a sense that they belong to a sort of pre-cosmic order stage that
or they precede the logic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So some scholarship says, well, they are. I think it's pretty accurate that in a sense these primeval heroes or these early heroes that are like Perseus and Heracles, they're sweeping, or Theseus, they're helping set up or clean up, let's say, the mess of this kind of in-betweenness, helping, I don't know, set up the new order of Zeus or something like that. But there is something about it that is definitely pre-natural order.
Yeah, they're making the world safer for mankind. Like, Heracles just clearing the roads, get out of the way, mankind's coming through. And I think, what you just said about relating it back to Zeus and the New Order is a lot of what it is according to the Greeks and their mythology, because that whole, Hesiodic battle between Zeus and Typhoeus is sort of the archetype of the hero fights monster, and then it sort of gets watered down after that, Apollo and the serpent at Delphi, and then various human heroes like Cadmus and the serpent at Delphi that we so it kind of just gets diminished because it's not at the deity level anymore. But it's Zeus's order, new ordered cosmos, and let's get rid of all of the previous generations and the old, again, chthonic exactly related deities like Gaia the primeval deities are just sort of greatly diminished, like Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings, like she's diminished and she goes into the West and all that, so yeah, it's just what Carolina was saying.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Though I was thinking before when we were talking about the misunderstood monster that you do maybe get kind of a little bit of what could look today like a boom in thinking about things from the perspective of that pre-human era in the Hellenistic period. I was thinking, because Debbie, you were talking about the story of Jason, so I was thinking it gets to Apollonius's representation of Medea, which you were talking about, Medea as this figure who becomes monstrous and maybe in a different version of the tradition. And also, Marianne Hopman had the chapter on Scylla, right? That, there's this kind of Scylla starts. They don't always start out necessarily as monsters, which I think is kind of another interesting story.
Medusa, too.
Exactly, right. And these are kind of Hellenistic, like you think of like Apollyon or, that sort of mode of exploring in a sort of, this epic in a minor key, maybe lens or again, mode for thinking through the monsters as they're gentler versions of themselves. Well, Carolina, maybe we could talk a little bit about your case study of the Sphinx, and you could say how you came to that and why you think the Sphinx is a particularly fruitful or generative case study in the context of these broader issues about monsters.
Yeah, I love the Sphinx. I love talking about the Sphinx. So stop me when needed. But basically, I think I came to it because I was looking at what we call, quote unquote, orientalizing material culture in ancient Greece and trying to trace the Near Eastern, influence or influx of ideas in the Greek world. And the Sphinx was this case where you have it represented all over the place, but not only in Greece, in Greek archaic art, right, where you have it in vase painting, like Orientalizing Proto-Corinthian vase painting and so on, in metalwork, and you have then archaic sculpture. You have it all over the place there, but then you also have it in the rest of the Mediterranean at the same time, appearing really what I've argued is as a kind of mark of influence from the Phoenician world, or the contact of various peoples with Levantine peoples, mainly the Phoenicians, because they were setting up colonies all over the place and they were very ubiquitous merchants, but not necessarily only. So I trace this iconographic Sphinx to this contact with the Levant, but then in mythological terms, it's so bizarre. You have this one story, right? And it only appears in connection to Thebes. Like there is only one mythological story about the Sphinx. And it's connected to this place, which moreover is such a locus for, I don't know, very old figures connected to the Near East in some way or another, like Heracles, Cadmos, obviously, Cadmos, and the Cadmeans, right? And then as a Phoenician prince in the myth, and even Dionysus. So what's going on in Thebes is a whole other. So it's very curious that it appears right there. So it's a case where there is a figure that is a hybrid creature of the type of, the Egyptian, Mesopotamian hybrid creatures, or Levantine or Canaanite, that appears a lot in the Levant as guardian, also as guardian of gates, or on graves, or in the Phoenician world, it appears a lot on thrones, like the thrones that have these two sides that are sphinxes, right? So if you look at them from the side, you have a sphinx on each side of the throne. So sphinx thrones, and these appear in the Phoenician world already in the earliest sarcophagus we have from a king of Byblos, a Hiram, and you have this beautiful throne, the dead king sitting on it. So they are throne guardians, and that resonates obviously with the Egyptian world of pharaohs being represented as sphinxes, and the cherubim in the Bible, right, guarding the hybrid creatures, winged, guarding the Ark of the Covenant, and all that. So there is that kind of sphinx, and then there is the the Theban Sphinx. So anyway, I put two and two. I mean, it seemed pretty obvious to me that there is some kind of relationship between that iconographic guardian throne Sphinx and the story of Oedipus, as the Sphinx is guarding the throne of Laios, the empty throne. And I don't know, I suggest that somebody at some point made that connection very early on, because this appears in Hesiod already, right? The Sphinx as the baneful, the plague of the Thebans. So it's a Theban thing, and at some point there was a kind of a jump, a transfer from iconography to a story where you have a hybrid creature guarding an empty throne. So there is this mismatch because she doesn't appear anywhere else in Greek mythology, and yet she's so. This motif becomes so famous, right, that we cannot lose sight that this is particularly a Levantine, probably Phoenician creature that has this double side, guardian and also monster. Like many of these monsters do have this. They have this double face that can be protective or scary or threatening, depending on whose side they're on, right? Which side of them you are on. So they appear a lot in the archaic Mediterranean in this context: funerary sanctuaries, and then thrones of deities or thrones of kings.
To what extent do you think, because one of the points I found really interesting in your chapter is that uniquely in the Egyptian side, do we see the Sphinx represented as masculine and wingless? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so to what extent do you think that somebody would have, who saw the Great Sphinx at the Great Pyramid, who would have equated these two, would have thought, oh, I know about that creature from the Oedipus stories, or vice versa?
That's a great question. I think they would have. I would think they would have recognized this as that kind of hybrid. But so a lion, basically a human-headed lion figure. That's what a sphinx is. But in Egypt, it's not. It's never winged. Whereas in the Levant and even in the Aegean world, even in earlier, like on Crete, but this is a kind of Levant, Eastern Mediterranean thing. You have griffins and sphinxes already with wings. So that comes from that part of the Mediterranean. So I think it's clear that that's a version of the broader guardian figure, but the Egyptian one seems to be kind of stuck into that pharaonic form, connected to the pharaoh as a masculine figure, whereas the Levantine one seems to end up being generally, from it seems, a feminine one. There is a great sphinx on a ivory. Canaanite ivory from Ugarit, I think, that has a lot of little boobs from like a dog, like a female dog, but like eight others. So it's like clearly a she dog or a bitch, let's say. And that's so striking because it's, I don't know, it's very, very odd. Usually you don't have that expressed that way, but in general, she seems to be feminine. So yeah, but would they have recognized it? I think probably yes.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to come back to this that you started getting at before is just how there is a little bit of, I wouldn't say disconnect, but the what we get in the iconographic evidence is a little bit of a different story than what comes through on the literary side of things. Is that something that is how often is that the case? How unusual is that? Because I think to me, it seemed to be one of the things that made the Sphinx a really interesting case study where there's something kind of bigger points that you made about the nature of the evidence.
Yeah, it's hard to reconstruct like what goes on. Like for instance, in the Greek world, where Greek people in general would have seen a Sphinx at the sanctuary of Delphi on the top of a column, which to me connects not with the Oedipus Sphinx, but with the Sphinx as a guardian of a sanctuary, right? In a sanctuary, and they put Sphinxes on top of gravestones and things like that. So for some Greeks were aware of the Sphinx as this motif that is some hybrid guardian, etc. Whereas we as scholars get stuck with the Sphinx from the Oedipus story, that is a very particular mythologized, mythological character in a story. But I think that's where the disconnect is, that if you look at it, if you look at material culture, you realize that both in Greece and the rest of the Mediterranean pretty much, there is this more general idea of the Sphinx, but that doesn't transfer, it seems, to literature, except to the degree that you think that, as I do, that the Oedipus story does have that in its heart, the throne, right, and all that. So yeah, I think that's a case of a disconnect in terms that the general public might have said that was, I don't know, that the Sphinx is it's that there's these two Sphinxes maybe, or that they wouldn't have been thinking of Oedipus' case necessarily.
Right. I'm reminded that there are other disjuncts between what there is in the art versus what we have in the literature. I'm thinking of there's a fairly famous Greek vase painting that shows what is apparently Jason, like, hanging out of the mouth of this huge dragon guarding the fleece. And so he's like in the process of being devoured or possibly spit back.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that one.
None of the literary sources mention that happening. And then there's a chapter in the handbook about cryptids in Greek art. So a bunch of vases with monsters that haven't been identified, or like hybrid, bizarre little monster-like creatures that haven't been identified with any literature yet. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's definitely, the Sphinx is like the main big example of a disjunct, but then there are these other smaller cases too.
Exactly, and the Sphinx it's striking because there is so much of it in iconography, and yet so little of it connected to Oedipus. But I think connected to this Mediterranean iconography that is a kind of koine, iconographic koine, connected to royalty and prestige, right, and Near Eastern kind of art in general. And so there is that, so it's very striking. But there are these odd cases, as David said. For instance, there's this weird pithoi, right, from where is it from Paros, or it's from one of the Cycladic islands, that has this image of an enthroned deity with an armed deity coming out of the head. So you think, oh, Zeus and Athena, but then both seem to be feminine, and then also there are these other winged creatures, guardians, all around it. Like, what are these, and what is this meaning? Like, there's so much we're missing. Not all of it, or very little of it, becomes encoded in iconography in the way that the Sphinx does. So that's what makes it interesting.
Well, I think it's a really helpful reminder too that even when we teach myth and make our little PowerPoint slides and everything, there's still, with the nature of transmission and things, that the handbooks, the literature is really emphasized. But this is all just a really helpful reminder that the ancient imaginary of this would have been so conditioned, more so in many cases, I think, by the visual.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that I was kind of happy with about the handbook, in terms of most of the chapters working in art in some way, and a certain number of chapters just devoted to the art completely.
Well, I want to end maybe where we could have begun, but this is where we'll end, is with the definition of a monster. And I think that in some ways it's kind of interesting to end with it in light of everything that we said, all the winding ways that we've taken in the conversation up to now. So maybe, Debbie, you could read the couple of sentences from the introduction where you kind of lay out what a monster for your purposes is.
So for the purposes of the volume, the Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth, readers will find that monster, in scare quotes, refers to a variety of creatures, most of them exhibiting physical anomalies, like an excess or deficit of limbs, unusually large size, and or jarring hybridity, and all of them in some way or another transgressing literal or metaphorical boundaries. Often, their main purposes in the stories are to act as disruptive agents, though the disruption may come only when they find their status as guardians threatened. At a minimum, these creatures prove unsettling in their unexpectedness, and at a maximum, they pose dire threats to humans and human attempts to settle into and impose order on the natural world. So, yeah, those are some of the basic characteristics.
That's great. And then I thought that it was so interesting, and I mentioned to you that I love this, the way that you use this Aesopic fable, the satyr and the traveler, to give a framework to the reader for approaching the volume. And would you mind reading out that fable and then perhaps telling us why you see it as programmatic here?
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's this is an Aesopic or Aesopian fable from a later fabulist, Avianus. And it basically has to do with perspective, so I'll go ahead and read it. When rough winter set in with thick frost, and every field stiffened under the hard ice, a traveler found himself stuck in a dense fog. The path was no longer visible, preventing him from continuing. The story goes that a satyr, one of the guardians of the forest, took pity on the man and offered to shelter him in his cave. The satyr, as a native of the wild countryside, was straightway both amazed and greatly afraid upon observing the immense power of the man. For first, to restore some vitality to his freezing limbs, the man thawed his hands by blowing hot air onto them. After the cold had dissipated, he began to enjoy the generous hospitality of his host. The satyr, eager to show off country life, had set out the best of what the forest had to give and offered a bowl filled with hot Liaean wine, so that its warmth would spread through the man's limbs and relieve the chill. But then the man cringed at touching the hot bowl with his lips and blew again with a cool breath. At this, his host, utterly terrified, was dumbstruck at the double portent, and the word used there is monstro, and, driving the man out into the woods, ordered him to go far, far away, saying, "I do not want anyone ever to come into my cave again," said the satyr, "who breathes two different ways from the same mouth." So, in its context of the fable collections, it's most specifically providing a metaphorical attack against lies and duplicity, saying one thing, doing another, saying two different things to two different people. And it, and again, in the context of fables, generally highlights man's unreliable and deceptive dual nature, rather than overtly referencing the dual nature of the hybrid satyr. And it's the satyr who represents normality here. It's the satyr who exhibits the emotions of terror and fear and alarm at seeing this, what the satyr considers monstrous behavior. So it's a different perspective. We are used to the man being the normal, neurotypical, we might even say these days. In terms of psychology anyway. But here it's the satyr whose perspective we are seeing the man's behavior from. And the reason that this fable sort of spoke to me as a good way to introduce the collection isn't so much because of its original meaning as, people are liars can't be trusted kind of idea, but the perspective taking that it's not what you expect. We are supposed to sympathize and empathize with the satyr's point of view, and the satyr is the non-human in this story. And it's just kind of a good lesson for monster studies in terms of who is the other, who does not fit in the environment of the cave and the forest and the countryside. It's the man who doesn't fit in that environment. So, from disability studies, you could say, well, this natural environment, being out in nature, kind of disables the man from being able to function, the way he normally would.
Well, I love how you start the volume by pairing that fable then with the section of Herodotus where you have the discussion of the people who eat their parents right in front of the Greeks, and that famous passage where that's the most horrifying thing to Greeks, and then by contrast the idea of burning the deceased is to the Callatiae is the most horrific thing, and that ending with that famous cap that nomos is king. I thought that was a really interesting move that you made to bring these two passages into conversation with each other to orient the volume.
I think it was important to point out that this different perspective taking did exist even in antiquity, and it's not just something we're bringing to it in our interpretation and reception sections of the volume, but that there was an awareness of cultural relativity even back then.
I love that.
And the way that, the monsters could be a hermeneutic, not only for other peoples, but, for the monstrous, for even their sort of own corpus of mythology.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the word monstrum does show up in Avianus's fable, even if there is no specific reference to monsters in the Herodotus, they are still horrified at each other's behaviors. And, I mean, it's probably worth mentioning in terms of monster theory, we probably should at some point bring in the original meaning of the English word, which it comes from two different Latin words, according to the etymologists. So it comes from monstrum, portent, from monstrare, to show, but also is related to moneo, to warn. So, and the original meaning of monstrum in Latin was a portent, something that's from the gods that's warning you about some behavior that may not be appropriate, that you're going to displease the gods if you don't heed. Oh, the Greek is a little different, teros, but it meant the same thing, a portent from the gods. And we do have teratology now as an English word in two different, completely different meanings. Teratology can be the study of monsters and the monstrous, but in like neonatology, I mean, in genetics and medical fields, teratology is the study of birth defects. So it's kind of an interesting, different uses of that word.
Can I ask you one quick question about this passage, which I love, because it has this, as you said, this lesson of, well, maybe humans are the problem. Humans are the we are the virus, right? So there's this whole nature culture, But in this sense, the satyr clearly represents nature, and there's a lot a lot of big lessons here about our current world situation. But are satyrs monsters? Are they really considered monsters in antiquity? Because they seem to fall into a weird category of their own. I don't know.
Yeah, by the definitions that we're using in the book, I think we have to include them because, we've got the chapter on monstrous peoples. And so we do have sections of the book that deal with human-animal hybrids, including centaurs, for example. And then, the sort of shift in satyrs where I think they started out as, was it half human, half horse before it became half human, half goat, and then segued into fauns in Roman literature. So in any case, the human elements do seem present, and a lot of the monsters are oddly anthropomorphized. I mean, the Cyclops is referred to as aner, as a man, in the Greek, in the Odyssey, which, has caused just so many problems in how we're going to interpret what is going on there. So I think it's fine to throw the satyr in there along with the centaurs and the cyclopes and other monstrous peoples is what we're calling them in the book. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. Traditionally, we wind down here with a word association game. So I'm going to throw out a couple of words and phrases, and I'll ask you to just say what comes to mind first. And so, Debbie, I'm going to start with you. And I'm going to actually, here's a little bit of a curveball. I'll say Heracles.
Monsters. See, that's no help.
Okay. How about you, Carolina?
Violence.
Violence, okay. And Debbie, back to you. How about just monster?
Yeah, I'm very bad at word association. I think I've been too immersed in this. When you say monster, it's like so many things all at once just come into my head. I think scary, maybe, is the first thing that comes to my head, even though that's not really one of our points is that they're not evil. I mean, they are scary. They can, evoke fear, but they're not necessarily intended, to be evil scary, just scary when you see them.
Well, that's helpful. How about for you, Carolina, monster?
Since I had more time to think.
Of course, I know. I'm going to mix it up here, so that's what people always complain about.
Strange.
Strange?
Or stranger.
Okay. And Carolina, this one's just for you. Sphinx.
Wings.
And then, Debbie, this one's just for you. The Satyr and the Traveler.
Aesop. Even though he didn't write it, it's Aesopian, not Aesop. But yeah.
That's okay. You don't have to justify your psyche. Okay. Carolina, Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth.
Awesome.
That's a really good one for this topic. Okay, and then, Debbie, that's the last one for you, too. Oxford Handbook of Monsters and Classical Myth.
The first thing that comes to mind is just amazing contributors.
Oh, well, that's very nice.
I mean, everybody was so amazing to work with. They got their stuff in on time. It was just wonderful.
You were a wonderful editor, I have to say. And having edited myself one of these handbooks, I know what a pain it is to chase people around. And you were always such a good coordinator, but also very encouraging, very responsive, and very guiding. I mean, you were amazing.
Well, speaking of wonderful, thank you both for being such wonderful guests on the podcast. Congratulations on the volume.
Oh, thank you for having us. It's nice for me to actually be able to, see Carolina instead of just emailing her. And
Exactly, meeting for the first time online. So congrats for the volume, and thank you, Johanna, for having us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesky Podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesky.